The myth of the Satanic Cabal, why the data points to Christians, not Satanists, in crime statistics. For decades, sensationalist headlines and conspiracy theories have painted Satanists as the sinister architects of a global cabal, allegedly orchestrating heinous crimes like pedophilia, human trafficking, and ritualistic violence. The image of a shadowy, horned figure presiding over a blood-drinking cult has been seared into the public imagination, fueled by 1980s satanic panic and modern-day fringe narratives. But when we strip away the hysteria and examine the hard data, a different picture emerges, one that challenges these myths and forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Violent crime, including some of the most egregious offenses, is disproportionately linked to those identifying as Christians, not Satanists. The Satanic Panic, a manufactured crisis. The 1980s Satanic Panic was a cultural wildfire sparked by unproven claims of widespread ritual abuse and devil-worshipping conspiracies. Books like Michelle Remembers and sensationalized media coverage fueled fears of a vast satanic underground. Daycares were accused of being fronts for ritualistic child abuse, and heavy metal music was blamed for corrupting youth. Yet despite thousands of allegations, no credible evidence ever substantiated these claims. The FBI's 1992 report by Agent Kenneth Lanning concluded there was no evidence of organized satanic ritual abuse, effectively debunking the panic. Despite this, the narrative persists. Modern conspiracy theories, like those tied to QAnon, recycle these tropes, alleging elite satanic cabals engage in child trafficking and blood rituals. The allure of these stories lies in their simplicity: a clear villain, Satanists, and a moral crusade, saving children. But the data tells a different story, one that demands we look at the numbers, not the myths. Prison demographics: where are the Satanists? If Satanists were truly the masterminds of violent crime, we'd expect to see their presence in the U.S. prison system, where the worst offenders are housed. Yet Satanists are virtually absent from incarceration statistics. According to a 2013 Freedom of Information Act request by Hemant Mehta, the Federal Bureau of Prisons, BOP, reported that only 0.1% of federal inmates identified as Satanists or practitioners of similar faiths, e.g. Wiccans, pagans. Compare this to Christians, who make up roughly 70-75% of the U.S. prison population, aligning with their share of the general population, 76% in 2014 per Pew Research. A 2012 Pew Research Center survey of state prison chaplains further confirms this. Chaplains estimated that Christians, primarily Protestants 51% and Catholics 15%, dominate the inmate population. Non-Christian groups, including Muslims 9% and pagans 0.1%, are far smaller, with Satanists barely registering. In fact, 12% of chaplains mentioned Satanism as a source of extreme religious views in prisons, but this was in the context of rare, individual expressions, not organized groups. The absence of Satanists in prison data is striking. If they were orchestrating widespread violent crime, we'd see a statistical footprint. Instead, the numbers point to Christians, specifically those within certain ideological subsets, as being far more represented among violent offenders. Christian extremism and violent crime, real cases. While the vast majority of Christians are not criminals, the data and case studies reveal a troubling correlation between certain Christian ideologies and violent crime. Far-right groups like the Aryan Nations and Christian Identity Movement, which cloak their white supremacist agendas in biblical rhetoric, have been linked to some of the most violent hate crimes in U.S. history. For instance, in 1998, 3 members of the Aryan Nations, a group tied to the Church of Jesus Christ Christian, attacked Victoria Keegan and her son, both Native Americans, in Idaho. The assailants fired shots at their car, forced them into a ditch, and assaulted them while shouting racial slurs. The Southern Poverty Law Center estimates that Christian identity ministries, active in 34 states, inspire such acts through a distorted version of Christianity that justifies racial supremacy. Another example is the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing by Timothy McVeigh, whose anti-government ideology was shaped in part by Christian identity literature. While McVeigh wasn't a devout Christian, his exposure to the movement's apocalyptic worldview fueled his actions, which killed 168 people. Similarly, the 2015 Charleston church shooting by Dylan Roof, who killed 9 black worshippers, was influenced by white supremacist ideologies often intertwined with Christian identity rhetoric. Even beyond hate crimes, studies suggest a link between certain Christian beliefs and criminal behavior. A 2006 Australian study of 111 male sex offenders found that those with strong religious affiliations, particularly those attending church regularly and holding beliefs in supernatural punishment, had more victims and younger victims than their less religious counterparts. The study suggested that rigid religious frameworks might sometimes enable rationalizations for deviant behavior. Contrast this with Satanism, which, in its organized forms like the Church of Satan or the Satanic Temple, explicitly rejects violence and abuse. The Church of Satan's own guidelines emphasize personal responsibility and ethical conduct, and studies, like one cited on X, suggest its members are statistically less likely to commit child abuse, a stark contrast to the Satanic Panic's baseless accusations. Why the discrepancy? Why do Christians, particularly those tied to extremist ideologies, show up in crime statistics while Satanists don't? Several factors may explain this. Population size. Christians make up the majority of the US population, so their representation in prisons is proportional. Satanists, estimated at less than 0.1% of the population, are too small a group to generate significant crime statistics. Cultural influence. Extremist Christian ideologies, like those of the Christian identity movement, have a broader cultural reach in the US, and particularly in rural areas where they can intersect with other risk factors like poverty and racial tension. Satanism, by contrast, is a niche subculture with no equivalent mainstream influence. Prison conversion. Many inmates adopt Christianity in prison, either for genuine spiritual reasons or to gain privileges, protection, or parole favor. This inflates the Christian demographic in incarceration stats. Satanism, lacking institutional support in prisons, doesn't see similar conversions. Moral prejudice. A 2017 study by Yukon anthropologist Dimitris Sigalatas found a global bias against atheists, with people assuming non-believers are more likely to be immoral or violent, e.g. serial killers. This prejudice extends to Satanists, despite data showing lower crime rates among non-religious groups, debunking the cabal myth. The idea of a satanic cabal of pedophile blood drinkers is not just unsupported, it's a distraction from real issues. The data shows that violent crime, including hate crimes and sexual offenses, is more likely to be committed by individuals tied to Christian ideologies, particularly extremist ones, than by Satanists. This isn't to vilify Christianity as a whole. Most Christians are law-abiding, but to highlight the absurdity of scapegoating a tiny, marginalized group. Satanists, whether from the Church of Satan or the Satanic Temple, advocate for rationalism, individualism, and secular ethics, with no evidence linking them to organized crime. Meanwhile, groups like the Aryan nations exploit Christian rhetoric to justify violence, and their impact is measurable in blood and lives. The real danger lies not in fictional satanic conspiracies, but in the tangible harm caused by extremist ideologies hiding behind mainstream religion. It's time to retire the satanic boogeyman and focus on the data. The numbers don't lie. Satanists aren't the problem. If we're looking for cabals, we'd do better to examine the ideologies already in our midst. By Scott Young, aka Sinfamous Gamer.